Has Upstream helped make your worldview bigger and older? Maybe something you've heard on the show has shaped the way you view your calling, habits, vocation, or recreation. We want to hear from you. Visit colsoncenter.org/up-listeners to leave us a short audio message. We look forward to hearing from you. Welcome to another episode of Further Upstream. I'm Shane Morris, here with my Colson Center colleague Kasey Leander to talk more about my conversation with Os Guinness about his new book, Signals of Transcendence. Now, Kasey, you are recently back from Mexico, a trip you took there with your bride, I believe, and Tim and I meant to rag you about this last week. It sounded like a really tough time.
Yeah, you got to suffer for the Lord sometimes, Shane. You know, Hannah and I were willing to take up that burden and do it. But I will say I'm so salty that you guys got to talk about movies. I was going to rock, paper, scissors, Tim, to see who got to do that further upstream, and he won. But I guess Os Guinness is a more than adequate consolation prize. So I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, I would have loved to hear some of the movies you brought up. We went through all kinds of nerdery last week, and that was a lot of fun. But there's an opportunity to go through a different kind of nerdery this week. And I did want to ask you, though, because you were down in, I forget which part was it, like Cozumel or Cancun?
Cancun, yep.
Okay. I wanted to ask you, this seems like a beautiful place. I've never been there, but it sounds like this is a place rife with natural signals of transcendence, as Os Guinness might put it. Did you guys kind of have an experience like that?
He did mention having a margarita on the beach, and right. You could say that particular signal of transcendence made its way through. So, no, it's gorgeous. But you know what the best part, and I'm not just saying this, it really was the people who staffed the hotel we were at. They were just lovely. Like, they were just committed to the discipline of hospitality. And I worked at a hotel for a little bit right out of college. I can't pretend that I was able to achieve that level of excellence that I saw, but it was just so fun. Yeah, it was amazing. So yeah, it was full of signals of transcendence. Did
you still fold your towels into those little swans and elephants and stuff and put them on y'all's bed? Yeah,
totally. It's just a matter of habit at this point. I'm just doing cloth napkin origami wherever I go. It's just one of the perks of being around me.
It's funny you should mention the staff, Kasey, because I had another friend who last year, he and his family went for this. It's like the first time they've done one of these family-wide international trips, but they went to Costa Rica. And he told me this story about, I don't know if it was a signal of transcendence exactly, but it was a moment of realization on his part where he went out in the morning and they're kind of in this jungly location, right? They're in the rainforest. He hears the howler monkeys. The birds are singing, and he's thinking, how amazing is this place? God's creation is all around me. It's glorious. But then he hears the neighbors, and these are actually residents, right? These are folks who live in Costa Rica. He hears them just down the side of the mountain or the hill, and their kids are playing, and they're kind of being noisy and stuff. And he said his first thought was, oh, they're ruining the pristine natural soundscape, right? And then he caught himself and he said, he realized, you know what? Number one, they live here and I'm a tourist. And how stupid is that? But number two, those are image bearers of God. Those are the highest creation of the Lord of heaven and earth, who stamped them with his very likeness. And their voices are actually the most amazing and transcendent thing that I will hear today, along with the voices and faces of every other person I encounter. And so what a privilege it is I get to hear that and to put that in the context of creation itself and in a right way, think about that rightly. I love that story because, aside from sounding a little bit first world and bougie to be like, I went to this place and had this experience in the jungle, I can totally get what he's saying because when I go out into natural spaces around my house, I'm definitely on some level looking to reduce the human presence. And it's a good thing to remember that human beings are themselves a signal.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that hospitality bit, at the risk of sounding overwrought, there actually is something that I think about with the wedding banquet of the Lamb. Our ultimate destiny as human beings is not going to be some drab, harp sesh floating on clouds. It's a feast. It's a banquet. And I think that imbues hospitality with kind of a unique kind of dignity. And it was the thrill of a lifetime actually being a part of that at the Broadmoor Hotel in Colorado Springs in my own small capacity. But hospitality just means I thought of you before you got here. And I think that was so excellent. And it's a privilege to be able to go on a vacation like that. But it just reminded me, like, we can practice that wherever we go. And what an incredible gift to offer other people is thinking about them before they get here and making it so nice. There is something deeply spiritual about that. It just mirrors the divine reality that we're all headed for when Christ himself sets the wedding banquet before us. That's going to be incredible.
I love that definition, thinking about someone before they get there. And of course, that's an aside from the conversation we're having now, but it's worth thinking about too, because hospitality is this deeply neglected art. It's just forgotten in so much of the modern world. Everything's on demand, everything's prepared, everything's prepackaged, everything's disposable. And we just forget the work and love that goes into an act like that. And Jesus himself was very keen on recognizing that. You see it even moments of like radical hospitality, like Martha. My pastor preached on this past Sunday, the section in Mark where his account of Mary, sorry, not Martha, her sister Mary, pouring out the oil on Jesus' feet, the expensive oil. It was like a year's salary, and the disciples freaking out about it, and him saying, "No, hush up. This is beautiful, hospitable, and worshipful of her. Don't deny her this." And of course, you could tie that back in a non-corny way with what we're talking about, because what Mary was doing there was recognizing the transcendent reality of who Jesus was, that there were things that were more important than the physical plane on which she was, on which the disciples were thinking, and on which she was dealing with something like a jar of nard. Right? This is very expensive. It's very valuable. It's worth a year's salary, roughly. It is so 300 denarii, I think was what Judas says. And it had all these purposes that would have been very practical. But she is alive and awake to these realities of who Jesus is and what he's doing, and the fact that he's going to die because she's anointing him for burial, is what he says at the moment. And that itself shows an awareness and an ear and eye for those transcendent realities. I try to cultivate that. And Os Guinness talks about how difficult it is in the modern world. And I like the different ways he expresses this. So he pulls on Plato's cave, Charles Taylor's The Eminent Frame, practical atheism is another one. I love how C.S. Lewis puts it, and Guinness doesn't mention this. He calls it the whole show in Miracles. And it's just this idea that stuff is all there is, right? We can't possibly look beyond or outside of it. But that imminent frame is, in many cases, a prison that blinds us to more important realities.
Sorry, I was just going to ask, Shane, which of these stories struck out to you the most, as you were reading Oz's book?
I think it was the story of his grandfather, Whitfield Guinness, and just the simple and beautiful love that he had for Oz's grandmother. It was like the poem that he wrote, and the sense that he had that, he quotes this pop song, right? That if love's not forever, then what's forever for? And that was the one story that stood out as different, because he's talking about a believer here, perceiving love itself as a signal of transcendence, that married love, right? And the sense that he wants this to go on and on forever, because love longs to go on forever. It demands, it chafes against death itself, because that's a limit that makes it feel, well, it denies what love actually is in a way. And that teaches us that the fall is an intrusion into reality. Death itself is an intrusion. It's not part of the original reality that's supposed to exist here. But yeah, I just love that story of the recognition that his grandfather had, even among, even in a very stressful and sort of crazy context as a missionary couple, right? In China, when they're dealing with all kinds of crazy stuff. And then Oz and his family would, of course, deal with deep tragedy later on, with two of his siblings dying due to this sort of basically man-made famine, communist-caused famine. But that one stood out to me because we're talking about a Christian here. The rest of the stories primarily are about non-Christians, non-believers, in some cases just atheists, right? Who experience some crack in their materialistic worldview, who experience an undeniable shaft of light shining through that tells them there's more out there than I've been willing to admit. And in some sense, I'm already aware of that something, whether it's a literal light, shining from shore, like it was for Malcolm Muggeridge, or the reassurance of a mother's love, like it was for Peter Berger, or for W.H. Auden and Philip Halley. Both of these individuals are looking back at the evils of the Holocaust and of Nazism, and they're actually making this sort of reverse syllogism, I guess you could call it. And Peter Berger describes it this way, that there are deeds that cry out to heaven, but also cry out for hell. And I brought up Jordan Peterson in that context because he's looking at the evils of the Soviet Union through some of the Russian writers like Solzhenitsyn, and he's drawing a very similar conclusion, especially in his first book, or the first popular book, 12 Rules for Life, where he says, in essence, evil is so real, so obvious, and so condemnable that there must be good. There must actually be a standard by which to condemn it. And it's a move very similar to what Lewis does in Mere Christianity. It's like, how are you calling that line crooked if you don't have some idea of a straight line? Why would you identify sickness if you don't have some idea of health? Evil is a privation and it implies good. And so that was a distinctive feature as well, and it really stood out to me, that there are some signals of transcendence that aren't, a pretty bird song or a sunshiny day or a rainbow or, a beach or something like that. Those are the signals that tend to get a hold of me. But there are really terrible signals that jar you out of your complacency and make you think, that's not natural. That's not human even. That's diabolical. And of course, humans participate in diabolical evil, but that is so wicked. There must be a consequence for that. Hell has to be real. But if hell's real, guess what? Heaven's real. And the one who sits on its throne is real. And that's kind of where you break your materialist worldview right there.
Yeah, man. I just think, so full confession, the book is not in my possession yet, but it's speeding on its way. Some Amazon guy is hustling right now to bring it to my front door.
You can speed through it too. It's only it's a little over 100 pages, right? It's 115 pages. So it's not a long read.
Just what struck me from your conversation though, Shane, was that Os Guinness is such a legend. We are so lucky to have him, to think about more than even the stories he's sort of accumulated over the years and has such a profound insight on it. He's just an incredible storyteller. I mean, we are so lucky to have spoken with someone who's seen so much of the 20th century, right? You listen to someone who lost siblings to China's Great Leap Forward. You listen to someone who actually has seen so much of this unfold in real time. It's like Oz's life is almost a living testimony to just the wisdom that he's writing down in this book. It feels like this book is just like gonna hit with piercing clarity. It feels like these stories remind you of what's ultimately true. And some of that rests on Oz's own just extensive experience as a human being on this earth. I don't know how many others like him we have right now who are writing at his level and with his depth of knowledge and wisdom.
Yeah, I was talking about this with my wife, Gabby, yesterday and early this morning when I was preparing for this conversation. And she agreed with me that one of the things that makes, I guess maybe the thing that makes Os Guinness distinctive as a thinker is he functions as a voice for the democracy of the dead. And he may listen to this. I would be honored if he did. And I hope that, he takes this not as flattery, but as a recognition of what I've really gleaned from him over the years. I mean, back when I was in my final class for my undergraduate, I wrote this. There was this paper, capstone paper. It's like a little baby, thesis kind of thing that undergraduates have to do. But it was long. It was a good sized project. And I wrote it on Max Weber's Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And I just kind of threw his thesis on its head and argued that Protestants work hard, not because we're trying to prove our predestination. No, that's a dumb idea. But that's what Weber said. But because we have a theology of vocation and of work and of calling that sacralizes ordinary work in a way that a medieval Catholicism obscured. And that was my argument. And I pulled heavily in the process of writing that from Os Guinness's book, The Call, which is probably still to this day my favorite thing that he's written, because it's all about vocation, right? And the thing that stands out from the moment I read that to the moment I had this conversation, this more than a decade of thinking and reading and interacting with his stuff, is that he's got this photographic memory, and he's able to bring you into conversation with all the great Christian and Western thinkers and writers, and even some non-Western thinkers and writers of the past. And he has this awareness of the fact that he's not the first guy to say this stuff. He's not the first guy to think these things. There are some writers, I think, who just throw quotes in just for the heck of it. You can tell they kind of just went on A to Z quotes.com and, pulled out something for a sermon illustration or a TED Talk opener. Or back when I was in speech and debate, we used to get these collections of quotes, and you just kind of randomly go through them and try to get a quote that to open your speeches with. And the judges were always like, ooh, wow, nice. H.L. Mencken. But,
Thank you.
You didn't know what the context of that was. Os Guinness knows the context of these quotes, and he's able to bring you in rich conversation with these people because he's read this stuff and he knows what they're talking about and why it's relevant to what you're talking about now.
That's what I mean. It's like they just don't make them like that anymore. Who's going to be the next Os Guinness? I just don't know if we have men of his caliber.
Plus the buttery British accent really helps too.
Oh, absolutely. And the baritone voice. Anyway, this is just an Oz of, I hope he doesn't listen to this.
Right.
To just think we're just two fanboys, which we are.
Yeah.
I was going to ask Shane, as you guys were talking in the episode, my thoughts went to someone like a Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is like kind of a more cynical, funnier Bill Nye the Science Guy, who's taken aim at theists and their dopey spiritualized conceptions of the universe. And sort of, we got to drill it down to like, his brand is like just brute facts. Like, here's some facts to like snap you out of your warm glow of whatever it is you're feeling about the universe. Like, the fact is it's all going to die in a heat death. Wham. But then he combines it. Part of his brand is like, but also look at how beautiful it is. And we should wonder at the scientific advancement. And to Neil deGrasse Tyson, that kind of makes sense in his mind, I'm sure. And there's kind of a whole brand of atheism that follows on his heels where they're combining atheism with wonder. So my question for you, just in reflecting on this conversation with Oz, is what would you say to someone who's stumbled upon this episode of Further Upstream and, maybe their Christian friends sent it to him and they're going, okay, look, atheism, not dead religion, not religious convention, is what leads to wonder. Like embracing the truth of science in its most pure form, that's what leads to a world filled with wonder.
Well, I guess my response is to ask, where does that wonder come from, and what's the objective standard for it? I mean, when you call something wondrous, when you look up at the sky and you do the Carl Sagan thing, right? And Carl Sagan is probably the fountainhead of the sort of attitude you're talking about here. He did the first Cosmos series. Neil deGrasse Tyson did this really awful knockoff sequel Cosmos a few years ago. And it was just, there were some okay moments in it, but it was very, very heavily based on his personal brand of, actually, it's like you think that the stars are pretty, but the stars aren't actually pretty. They're just nuclear fireballs. And it's nothing buttery. We called it that on Breakpoint years ago. We came up with this term, nothing buttery. It's like the stars are nothing but, a forest is nothing but, the rainbow and the ocean and the pretty fish and a beautiful symphony are nothing but this and that. And that's all you've got when you're a materialist. I guess Miracles by C.S. Lewis is the best response I know to this. And I've called this the best nonfiction book that I've ever read. And I really think it is that because it's much more than just a polemic against materialism. He gets deep into the theology of what miracles are, and then what this grand miracle of the incarnation and the atonement is, and what it means for us now. But his opening critique of materialism, Neil deGrasse Tyson style materialism, is just so devastating because he harnesses that understanding of wonder, that sense that there's much more going on, even in your own thinking, and your unshakable conviction as a human being, as a scientist, as a writer, as a whatever it is your profession is, that your thoughts mean something, that your evaluations of things are objectively correct, or can be objectively correct, or meaningful, that something that goes on in your head, and Lewis is very skeptical that things really are just going on in your head, but to concede that materialist assumption, that those things can correspond in some meaningful way to reality. Lewis thinks they do, and that we all know they do. But the problem, he says, is that if everything is cause and effect, if everything is simply one thing in a clockwork universe causing another thing according to established laws, there's no freedom, and there's certainly no transcendent touchstone that humans have access to. No framework from which we can look at a waterfall, for instance, and say, that's sublime, right? Like Coleridge does. Then it's meaningless to say those things. But we're not ready to say it's meaningless. And that's his kind of foothold, where he gets a hold of you and says, you know it's meaningful. You know you have real thoughts in your head that are not just the result of atoms bouncing off of each other in a causal chain that stretches back to the origins of the universe. And at that point, I guess he's beginning to encounter the Big Bang cosmology and stuff. So that's the irreversible conclusion. If atoms, energy, quarks and leptons, and the whole configuration of the material universe as we know it, if that's all there is, then those are the only causal entities that we can invoke. Those are all that cause things. But if our thoughts are experienced as reality, then the choice is very simple. Either they are caused and determined by those material entities and all that they do and how they interact, or they're caused and determined by something outside of material reality as we know it. And that's where Lewis, bites down hard on that mentality and critiques it. So yeah, I just run the same play that Lewis does and say, this isn't the whole show. It's not the whole show. And if you think it's the whole show, then your thought, and this is where he overlaps a lot with Alvin Plantinga and his evolutionary argument against naturalism, where he says, if you assume this is the whole show and you're just, your thoughts are nothing but epiphenomena of atoms bouncing off each other and conjoining and stuff, then that thought itself is suspect because it has no reason to be objectively related to reality.
It's so interesting on different college campuses how many stone cold nihilists I've actually encountered where I'll just start asking about meaning and purpose. Like, why is that meaningful? And, you'll sometimes get an intermediate answer is like, why do you love your mom? Well, we've evolved as a species so that our brains respond to maternal, overtures towards us. We feel a certain loyalty towards the people who raised us. And I would never want to do the gotcha thing. I'm just trying to ask questions and get people to bring their worldview out of the toy chest and sort of show like, what do you actually think? So I just ask, I think that's a really good answer for why you do feel affection for your mom. My question is, why should you feel affection for your mom? And it's amazing actually I've done this conversation with, easily 24 different people. And each time it's taken about an hour just to like kind of wind the whole thing down. But it's so rare to argue someone out of nihilism. I've encountered so many people who have just said, you know what? I don't know. I don't think there is a should. At the end of the day, nothing really matters. And that's just how it is. It just be like that, And I'd just be like, I respect that. But I also think at the end of the day, if you see a child drowning in the river, you're going to act out of selflessness because you feel that you should. And you actually, more than just feeling you actually should save that child and put yourself on the line. I don't know. It's interesting just talking about these signals of transcendence. I feel like there's something so Holy Spirit driven that we can have in conversation with friends and neighbors. And yeah, I'm stuck. And I guess the reason I'm saying this, Shane, is that you guys hit on this. I'm stuck by the ways that it's so difficult to argue someone out of Plato's cave.
It's very difficult for a lot of reasons. And we have, as Christians, I think we have the tools to explain why it's so difficult, because people are self-deceived and they're not objective in their evaluation of the world around them. I mean, the passage par excellence of general revelation is, well, it's Romans 1 and 2. We get the revelation of sort of natural theology and then natural law right there in the first two chapters. So Paul says that we have the evidence available to us to understand and see God's existence. The invisible attributes of God, his eternal nature and Godhead have been revealed since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. So we're without excuse. They've been clearly perceived in those things. And then he says that the law itself, the requirements of the law, are written on the hearts of the Gentiles in chapter 2. And that's your natural law. That's your sensus divinitatis. That's the sense that God is a judge, he's righteous, and that he has moral requirements, and that on some level the moral requirements. But I guess when I confront someone like that and I reach the point of them saying, well, I guess, there is no real objective reason why I should love my mother. It's just that I do, and that's an is, but there's no ought. My first instinct is really to just corner them and go, you don't believe that. You do not believe that for real. I mean, you're lying to me right now. What you believe that that loving your mother is a good thing, and that mother love is a good thing, right? You really do believe that to the bottom of your toes. You believe that. You're just denying it in this half-hearted, mealy-mouthed way in front of me right now because you think it's necessary to make your argument or your presuppositions consistent, right? You've just been cornered into this position, and you're not even happy about saying this because you know more than you're letting on, right? And I'm willing to bet a bunch of people at that point would go, yeah, you're right. I know that it's true. I just don't know why or how it's true because I don't have the resources to say it. And at that point, I guess I would just go, isn't that significant? Don't you think that innate knowledge has got to be more than just your emotional programming or wishful thinking or something like that? And that's what Oz is talking about with these, part of what he's talking about with these signals of transcendence. And he mentions that, at the beginning of our conversation, that proofs of God are fine and dandy as far as they go, but he doesn't think they're actually that effective typically, at least in apologetic or evangelistic context. They can remove some barriers, but they're probably not the thing that actually pushes through and pierces that materialist worldview. What really does that is this experiential, unmediated sense of something beyond or outside or above the immanent frame. And that's what you're getting at when you corner someone and you say, that loving your mother is good. And that's not just because of an accident of evolution, right? My favorite example is this is where knowing a little bit of biology really comes in handy, or zoology, I guess, in this case, where you could point to something like the big cats. Okay. And this is one of the evolved behaviors of basically all the big cats, especially lions, is that they're when a male comes along and he kind of claims a new group of females, a new territory or a new pride, whatever, he's going to kill off the offspring of the previous male that he's deposed or defeated or killed. And that's, according to, the materialist worldview, that is an evolved feature of lions. That's actually part of their survival mechanism. They're programmed to do that. And to look at a lion and go, why did you just kill all those cubs? It's like a Holocaust. You're a wicked, bad lion, bad boy. Why would you do that? He's just going to look at you like, well, he's not going to understand what you said, but if he could, he would just go, what's wrong? This is my programming. This is what I am. I'm just a lion doing lion things. You can't blame him for it. It's idiotic. As one of the characters in The Silver Chair tells Prince Rillian, when he's going to look for the snake that bit his mom and killed her, he's like, give it over, sire. Your search for the brute. There can be no true vengeance upon a witless beast as there can be upon a man, because he's recognizing he thinks a snake's just a snake. And he recognizes that you can't get revenge on a snake because they're not moral agents. Neither is a lion. And when you look at that evolved behavior and you ask someone, and again, sticking in the materialist worldview here, kind of granting it for the sake of argument, when you look at that behavior and then you ask them, okay, what if humans were to evolve in that direction in the future? What if it became advantageous for our survival for males to kill off the offspring of other males so that they could, devote the females' time and resources to raising their offspring? And that was actually what helped us survive. Would that then be good? Would that be morally acceptable? And the person who says our instincts are just evolved survival mechanisms has to say, yes, that would be good and moral. But that's a moment where they know otherwise, that their knowledge betrays them.
Right. Another good way to look at it is by going back to the past and say, on what grounds, let's say you had a time machine, would you be a reformer against American slave trade, for example? If the answer is yes, then they're not actually stone cold materialists. They actually have some reason for arguing in that way. But, far be it from me to disagree with Oz on apologetics and talking to people. I think he's dead right, actually. But, I would say a phrase that I've heard before that was really helpful is, no one was saved just through apologetics, right? No one was ever saved by apologetics, but no one was saved without apologetics either. Because apologetics just means to give a defense for the reason that we have. So sometimes those intellectual barriers need to come down. But yeah, I mean, even thinking about, as you're talking, Shane, it's like flashbacks to so many of these conversations. And what you need is the Lord. What you actually need is the living Holy Spirit to move in someone's heart. And unless that's there, none of the arguments are going to work. But it is amazing in those conversations when you're comparing worldviews, the differences that start to emerge. And that's been one of my favorite experiences of doing sort of apologetics on different college campuses and different settings.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And it corresponds well with the experience of, the guy we come back to. And he's in this book, of course, C.S. Lewis and his experience. He's one of the guys who got a signal of transcendence and that led to or catalyzed his conversion. But in Lewis, you see this marriage of apologetic arguments working with a signal of transcendence or a sense of there being something more. And so if you follow this thread through his autobiography, then this is fresh in my mind because Max McLean did that great adaptation of it, The Most Reluctant Convert, where he's drawing from Surprised by Joy, but he's also piecing together a bunch of other details from the rest of Lewis's work. So you get this really fun journey through Lewis's conversion. But he's got, on one side, he's got the sentiment or experience of joy, what Lewis calls joy, and that's his kind of technical term for it. It's not happiness, it's not pleasure, it's something much more sort of difficult to get a hold of or express than that. And this is the way Lewis says it, is that joy is a longing, an inconsolable longing that is preferable to the greatest happiness or pleasure this world has to offer. So he would rather feel the unfulfilled, inconsolable longing of the joy he's talking about, that desire for something better and bigger and further up and further in, than he would have any earthly appetite fulfilled. Isn't that interesting? He likes the ache. It's better to long for something that he can't have than to, within the material world, than to even get the best the material world has to offer. And that's what he calls joy. And he describes all the evolution of that sense from his childhood throughout his adult life and how it ultimately provides sort of the fuel that's necessary to get him through the apologetic arguments into real belief, because he's chasing joy. But the apologetic arguments marry very well. They mesh in with that search for joy, because his, and he reviews this in Mere Christianity, one of his chief objections to Christianity, one of the chief things that kept him an atheist, was precisely this argument from evil and suffering that so many people go to. It's that, like, look, the world is so full of terrible evil and suffering and wickedness and violence and all that. And how could a good God be behind all of that? But as Lewis points out, that's a double-edged sword that an atheist can slice his worldview open on, because the question is not how can a good God allow such evil and suffering? The real question is, what is evil and suffering, and how can you recognize them without a good God existing, right? This is the straight and crooked line. And you have to, it's a simple choice. You can either believe there's a good God despite the evil and suffering and harmonize them in some way, or you can deny evil and suffering. But you can't have the best of both worlds as atheists see it and try to do. And Lewis realized that. Yeah,
rightly so. One question I had, Shane, is what would you say to any of our listeners who are really grappling with divine hiddenness? They're hearing about these signals of transcendence, and maybe they can read, different experiences other people have had about God, but in their own life, they feel kind of a dry, just lack of a sense of the presence of God. Do you think that this book will speak to people in that situation? / how would you respond to, one of your Upstream listeners who's maybe going through a season of wrestling with that?
Well, absolutely. This book can powerfully speak to that. Just this classing certain things, experiences that we have as one thing, all the disparate experiences of seeing evil or seeing all the way to seeing a dandelion like G.K. Chesterton did. And his story is told in here in brief as well, and everything in between. Just describing all those things as one thing, as a signal of transcendence, is helpful because it allows you to notice those things going on in your own life. I think a lot of what people experience, and they call them religious experiences, and they'll often go in Eastern mystic direction or a pagan direction with them. Those things are misappropriated signals of transcendence. Those things are realizations of the spiritual world all around us and the meaning that's imbued in the material world and in the creation that we try to deny, and then people follow them in the wrong direction. This is the inadequacy of general revelation to bring about salvation. You need special revelation, and you need the work of the Holy Spirit as well, opening people's eyes and ears so that they can see and hear what's all around them and then what's in God's word. So number one, you get that vocabulary and conceptual categories, I guess, to describe what it is you're experiencing. And I agree with Oz. I think that most people at some point in their lives have experienced something like this. And when you speak of, he even says that when he talks to people about signals of transcendence or uses some of that language, that the synonyms that he used for it, people's eyes will light up and they'll say, I know what you're talking about. I've had that experience. I have had a moment where I've realized a moment of lucidity where I looked outside of this imminent frame and said, oh man, there's more. I know there's more. And I can't explain what just happened there. It doesn't even need to be a miracle. It can be a subjective thing, like it was with Augustine, with the child's voice that immediately arrested him providentially. But I guess what I would say to someone who has a dry experience of the world and says, I don't think I have signals of transcendence. I don't think that God is reaching out or getting a hold of me in that way, or I don't think that I'm seeing evidence of something beyond the material. I would say, first of all, read Miracles, because Lewis's opening salvo is to make the case that your own mind, not your brain, your mind, your conscious experience of the world and your consciousness of yourself being a real entity is itself a sort of miracle. He draws back from calling it a miracle, but he says it's at least technically supernatural because it's not measurable in the categories of molecules and in motion and energy, matter and energy. You can't measure it in that. Thought, logic, reason, consciousness, selfhood, those things are simply ineffable in material terms. And so by the very act of thinking, it's sort of like a Descartes type move, a Cartesian sort of move. By the very act of thinking, you are admitting a sort of miracle or sort of supernatural thing. And so that's the beginning of his argument, but he gets much, much deeper and more, powerful than that. But then I'd say even beyond Lewis, you need to look at a book like, and there are lots of books that sort of do this in various ways, but the one that's been really helpful for me is James Jordan's Through New Eyes. And this has served this role for many people. I know that Alistair Roberts especially points back to this and says this was a fountainhead of wisdom, and it was like a turning point in his life. And I know even Eastern Orthodox readers who look at this and say, this re-enchanted the world for me. But Through New Eyes, the premise is very simple. It's that the world and the word, so creation and the Bible, are both typological in nature, and they should be read for their interlocking typology of meaning. So that when you look at the Bible, you can't read it as a mere set of propositions. It's not. It works through typology, and it has a story and story forms and motifs that repeat and build on each other. They nest, they build, they enhance, they grow. And these symbols all mean things. And the meaning is largely found not in the ability to just read black and white sentences on the page, but in the ability to discern those themes and those types that repeat and build on each other, and how they all come together in this marvelous symphony in the story of Christ. And I think once you perceive the way Jordan's talking about Scripture that way, even if you disagree with some of the particular applications he makes, you realize this is a divine book. You realize what the confessions mean when they speak of Scripture testifying to its own, it bears internal testimony of its divine origin. What do they mean by that? Well, I think part of what they mean is that Scripture is built and written in such a way that the typology is supernatural. No person or group of persons could have put together something that coheres this well on this subtle of a level artistically as literature, right? And then Jordan's other thing is you got to read the world like literature. Read it typologically. And he gets into some really cool stuff like the fact that trees have meaning. The structure of trees is a divine testimony. It's like a microcosm or temple that works in the world.
What does that mean, Shane? What does that mean?
What does that
Tell
mean?
Me more.
I mean,
Tell me more about the trees.
You have to read the book, but there's a reason the mythologies of so many peoples around the world had sacred trees at their heart. Yggdrasil in Norse mythology, and I don't even think he mentions that one, but it's a great example of you have a cosmic tree, and Tolkien picks up on this too, right, with the two trees in the Silmarillion, because he's influenced by Norse mythology. But this idea of a cosmic tree being a holy bridge between the various levels of reality, heaven and earth. And there's like a middle earth, a Midgard, a sort of a thing in between. That's where the people live. But then there's the underworld, and then there's the upper world, the heavens. The tree is a bridge between all these places. And Jordan's argument is that trees actually do have meaning. And the reason that they're shaped the way they are and do the things they do and are central in the biblical narrative, right? Trees are one of the most recurring symbols in the entire Bible. The Bible is bookended by trees at the very beginning and the very end. Jesus dies on a tree. There's a reason that it's spoken of in that way. They have rich theological heft, and the Bible and the world both work together to realize that. And that's just one example. Like mountains are another excellent example, because they're a recurring motif, and they often recur with trees. They come together. And people like C.S. Lewis understood this. It's why you read The Magician's Nephew, and what do you have there? Right at the climax of the story, a mountain and a tree, and there's a garden, and it's like a temple. And some of the things in that garden temple are they're reminiscent to the things in the tabernacle and Israel's temple. All that stuff Jim Jordan will get you started on that trajectory. We affectionately call him Jim Jordan. But yeah, that's a kind of book that'll wake you up to the stuff that you see around you that you just take for granted. There are no ordinary things. There really are not. And when you have new eyes to see the world as it truly is, it's re-enchanted for you. Your materialism, even if you're a Christian, you've got some barnacles of materialism on you. It just falls off when you begin to see the world this way and look at it typologically.
Yeah. You talking about trees makes me think of just how much of the world is driven by information technology. And, the question is, where does information come from? It doesn't spontaneously generate. It comes from a mind, and it's there for a purpose. So even the DNA that fuels living things, I mean, we have no idea how that first information generated, or, it's so specific. It's that argument from specified complexity that I still find so compelling, even though it's been, around for years and years. I mean, that one still gets me. I was going to say though, Shane, NPR did an article a while ago, but they found that 80% of Americans believe in miracles already. And furthermore, a different study from Gallup said 1 in 3 roughly say they have seen a miracle personally. So if we're looking for signals of transcendence, part of me is like, it's not even about the knowledge that these things could be possible. I think we are aware that this didn't happen by accident. You know what I mean? And I think there is that innate knowledge. And I just think that goes to Oz's point that, you asked him, do people instinctively know what you're talking about when you show them this book? And he said, yes, they absolutely do. To me, that kind of makes the point that the universe is fundamentally knowable to human beings. And that actually cuts deeply against the grain that I've noticed of our culture, which wants to say that there's so much information in the world that nothing's really knowable. Like there were just so many different cultures, each of which had such a radically different view of God and the world and human beings that, how do we pick from the billions of answers out there? And while there's a grain of truth in that, Lewis himself makes this point that there's actually only like 5 or 6 major answers you can go with. You can say everything is God. You can say there is no God. You can say there is a God and he's personal. You can say there's a God and he's impersonal. But after that, you start to run out of ways that that big picture, the universe could be configured. And so to Oz's point, I mean, I like that it provides a little bit of clarity and it cuts against the grain of culture, which says that the universe is just fundamentally unknowable. Actually, those things do call out to deeper truths, and those truths are knowable. There's a certain logic to it where it can't be, one of 80 billion different ways. There's actually logically speaking, there's only a few different configurations how this is gonna unfold.
Yeah, where you get into the differences between people is in what they find compelling, what signals them toward something higher and greater. Because, like you said, it's going to be different for every person. If somebody's going to hear the voice of a child across a fence and saying take up and read, and go, well, that's just a kid. I'm just going to ignore that. But and it truly, objectively, in and of itself, doesn't have, or intrinsically, I should say, doesn't have an intrinsic meaning as a signal of transcendence. But Augustine perceives it that way because he's in a certain frame of mind, having gone through a certain set of arguments and had a certain pattern of contemplation and questions, and having prayed certain prayers, and he gets to that point, and he perceives that immediately and sharply as this signal that turns his whole life around.
Well, it's God going after Augustine specifically and personally.
Yeah. And this is what I think, I guess on the miracles thing, I wouldn't push back on the majority of Americans saying they've seen a miracle. I would want to nuance that a little bit, because, and there are various good books that discuss this, but what is a miracle exactly? And many people are defining miracle essentially as something that is improbable enough and meaningful enough that it has to have come from God's intention, or a God's intention, or some force outside of the whole show, the natural course of things. And that's fine as a functional definition, but I think it probably obscures the difference between miraculous intervention and providence. And because God is, this is one of the things that you think about when you subscribe to a Reformed confession, like the Westminster Confession or the Belgic Confession and Heidelberg Catechism and stuff, that God actually ordains everything that comes to pass, that in some sense he's providentially orchestrating and in control of everything. It doesn't mean he's the direct cause of everything, but he is the first cause. He is the one that sustains everything. And that means that in some sense, everything happens by his ordination or permission. And when you believe that, and then you believe that God is actually good and his character is reflected in all his decrees, then everything becomes material for that. The particular scene that confronts you when you step outside of your door in the morning, the particular bird song, or the particular neighbor who says hi to you or whatever, all those things are in some providential sense meaningful. And God is in control of those things. And so what do you do with that? And if there is agency under that, if God really is orchestrating all things together for the good of those who love him and are called according to his purpose, and for his own glory in the governing of the universe, then nothing is truly random. Nothing is truly just senseless. It's a way of looking at the world. But it also, I guess, you are required to look at something that rises to the next level, where somebody lays their hands on a person with stage 4 cancer, and the next day they go in for a screening and the doctor says you're cancer free. Like, that's not providence, pure providence. That's actually a miracle. That was actually God reaching in and rewriting the causal chain of events. And that's especially striking. But I guess I would try to distinguish between those two things. Like, I heard something that struck me as meaningful, but otherwise was ordinary, versus God reached down and actually did something in an immediate way.
Totally. And that's such a fair point, because Oz is writing about sort of the signals of transcendence. He didn't write a book on miracles as such, right?
See J.P. Moreland for that. His book, A Simple Guide to Experience Miracles. And I interviewed him on Upstream like a year and a half or 2 years ago about that.
Right on. I was going to ask Shane, for you, if Os Guinness said, Shane, give me a signal of transcendence from your life, and I'll incorporate it into my book. Like, I'm giving you a freebie. What would you say? Like, do you have a good answer? Do you have like a story that you would want to add to this sort of corpus?
Oh man, that's such an amazing question. There are a lot of things in my life I think probably rise to the level of a signal of transcendence, and many of them will center around experiences in nature, realizing and looking at things and just having this moment of profound thankfulness, like Andrew Peterson sings in that song, Don't You Want to Thank Someone? I love that song. It's like 10 minutes long and it's so meandering, but you just, by the time you're done with it, you feel like you've had this experience of worship and higher perception, because he starts with just a simple question, Have you ever wondered why, in spite of all that's wrong here, there's still so much that goes so right and beauty abounds and like babies crying and stuff. And he ends with a swirling storm of cherubim making ready for the judgment day and the reckoning. But it's all about, you have this sense of thankfulness. It's innate. You see something beautiful. You see a snowy peak, or you see a gorgeous beach, or you hear a piece of music, or you see a piece of art, and you think, I want to thank someone. I just want to say thank you for that. I don't know what people do who don't believe in God and look at all that stuff and want so bad to say thank you. Just that prayer. That's probably there's two prayers that are really common for me, and they're like those mental involuntary prayers. The first one is thank you, Lord, for this. And the other one is help me, Lord. That's a really common reflexive one as well. But that's a clear signal of transcendence. I would say, I don't know that I've clearly experienced a miracle in the formal sense ever in my life. And I'm not really ashamed or embarrassed or disappointed by that in any way, because I think probably a lot of people would share that experience. They would say, I've just never seen an unambiguous miracle. But have I seen things that are clear signs of transcendence and clear signs of providence? Yes, absolutely. They come down to things like reading a book just at the right moment to answer a particularly thorny question, or preparing me for a specific conversation. There was a day a few years ago when someone that was a very dear family member of mine who'd invested very deeply in my life, who took his life. And as my parents and I and one sibling were driving over to sort of deal with the aftermath and get the family together and figure things out, I just started singing hymns in the van, and the hymns were just sort of coming to me, and it was very unintentional sort of thing. It wasn't something that I planned or thought. I'm going to I'm just going to sort of speak into this moment with song. And I'm not even the kind of person who typically does that sort of thing, but just, key hymns were coming to me and it felt necessary in that moment. And is that a signal of transcendence? Is that a reaching for something, or something reaching for me? Maybe both. I don't know, but I know that it helped me, and I'm fairly certain it helped my parents as well in that moment. So yeah, there's a lot I could name. I'm sorry to disappoint you with a lack of specifics, or like a story of how, a book like fell open and the wind blew some pages and all of a sudden this thing is right there in front of me. I don't necessarily have anything like that, but yeah.
I mean, I resonate with that feeling, though. It's like, I don't think most people have, been almost struck by lightning or knocked off their donkey and had, the risen Christ say, "Why are you persecuting me?" Anything like that. I remember at age 13, I read a book by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek called "I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist." And in that book, they lay out just the rudimentary cosmological argument for the existence of the universe. They just say everything that exists, or everything that begins to exist, must have a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore, the universe must have a cause. And then they lay out what could possibly be the cause of everything. At age 13, I just put that book down, and I think I just probably fell back down on our carpet in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and looked at the ceiling and went, "Oh my gosh, it's all true. It's all true. It's not just Sunday school. It's not just felt boards. It's not just church. It's all true. Where did this all come from? I don't know. It has to be God."
Yeah. An Eastern Orthodox friend of mine, I've had him on the podcast, Seraphim Hamilton. His birth name's Thomas. And he calls those, "Oh my God, Christianity is true" moments. And that's oh my God in the truest non-vain sense. It's like, it really is true. The stories are true. And you forget that there are these kind of scales on your eyes that are blinding you constantly, or that you're professing Christianity in a sort of provisional, half-hearted way. But then all of a sudden something like that strikes through at you, and you see the rational chain of arguments that actually demonstrates one of the key tenets of Christianity, like the fact that there is a God, there has to be a God. Then it can knock you flat on the floor.
And it's like, I think one of the best outcomes that could come of us talking about this, Shane, is have our listeners go ask God for more of those moments. And boy, I ask about divine hiddenness because I've wrestled. There've been years of life where I've just felt like, Lord, where are you? Where's that cosmological argument moment? I'd like some of that right now. And he withholds his hand. And I wonder, he's got purposes for that too, knowing that he wants us to walk as adult children and not just rely on him to bottle feed us all the time. You know what I mean? It's like my Bible's sitting right over there. I could go read it, but instead I'm like, why don't you knock me off my mule, Lord? And, give me some kind of sign. It's like he, in his providence, can do whatever he wants. Still, I think there are more of these signals just waiting around. And if we had eyes to see, I think we'd ask for them more and, ask for miracles as well. But in a more ordinary sense, why not look at the structure of DNA in the cell? Why not ask where the universe came from? Another moment that's hitting home for me right now, Shane, is my grandfather passed away this week at 93 years old. And he loved Jesus. He was such a great figure in my life, just steady, calm. He was just like a workhorse, understated, but so excellent in everything he did. And when you and Oz were talking about, is love meant to last? I just think there has to be more than this life, because what an injustice that the world is now devoid of that wonderful man, my grandfather. And just to feel the rushing passage of time, I think for me, prompts so much existential musing these days. Losing, now that's the last of the grandparents on that side to have gone to go be with Jesus. And I'm like, wow, okay, life is happening right now. So for me, to Oz's point, not all of the signals are happy. Some of them are actually, they feel quite like a crisis, but I think they're meant to wake us up to a deeper reality. So for my part, that's where this conversation is hitting me right where I live right now.
Yeah. And we've gone a long time on this one, but I think it's worth it because this is rich, what we're talking about here. And it's hitting me hard too. And death is itself, whether we're talking about, a life well lived, a race well run, or one that was cut short prematurely by choice, by a wrong choice, like the loved one I'm talking about. Death itself is a signal, an undeniable signal of transcendence, because it forces us to confront things that I don't think anyone's quite willing to fully swallow the poison pill of a materialist view of that, because you really do come to ultimate ruthless nihilism about it. Like your existence doesn't matter. It does not matter. Everything you do will be forgotten very shortly. Everything you've done is ultimately meaningless anyway, because human life is meaningless, finite, meaningless, and the universe itself will spin down into meaninglessness. And so if no one's willing to really bear that weight. I think even people who try to do it, they end up doing this existential reverse Uno card where they try to be like, yeah, but that's what makes it so meaningful because it's so effervescent and fleeting. You're just saying nonsense right now. You're just saying meaninglessness is meaningful. That's all you're doing. That doesn't actually make it meaningful. And so death does that for you. But one of the things that I realized very recently, and this was another conversation I had with my wife, I think yesterday, was that birth is meaningful in the exact same way. The opposite end of life, the beginning of life, is a signal in such a powerful way. Not just watching it, although we've got a 10-month-old watching your baby come into the world and begin to grow into this little conscious communicative person is a wonder. It's like it borders on the miraculous. But I'm talking about your own birth and beginning. So look back, Kasey. Think back on your earliest memories. And this is what we were talking about. What's your earliest memory? And look back and picture that. And then try to push back further than that. There may be some like feelings or vague things. Like I have this, my first memory is tadpoles. My dad was like helped me raise tadpoles in a jar from the ditch behind our subdivision. And that's my first, that and a Sesame Street train that I had, a toy. But then before that, there's maybe some vague feelings, some voices, some the look of the bottom of my parents' couch that I was always crawling next to, I guess. It's just like there's a particular fabric pattern that's burned in my memory. Kind of washed out blue memory. With little white and pink flecks on it, whatever. This is a very 80s couch. But then there's nothing, right? Before that, there's nothing. So the experience of looking back, and maybe not everyone shares this, but for me, it's super trippy. The experience of looking back and going, I began. There is a point where my own memory simply runs out and I become nothing. I popped into existence at some point. Whoa, that blows my mind because I feel right now like such a permanent entity. I feel like I must always have been here, but I wasn't always here. And I have eternity written in my heart because I believe and have this sense, I think, innate sense that I will always be around in some form. I'm an immortal, like Lewis says. I will not cease to exist. I'll either be a eternal glory or an immortal horror, like all people will be. But that beginning is just so steadying. It gives you this sense. If you think about it long enough, it's a sense of vertigo. And I've had certain people say that feeling of vertigo of like I began to exist corresponds very closely to the feeling that some people who are more mathematically minded have when they think about mathematical paradoxes and eternity. So like think about the fact that the numbers never end, that there is such a thing mathematically, a concept of infinity. That itself is vertigo inducing, and that can be a very rational signal of transcendence.
I'm from my home state is Colorado, Shane, and I can picture a lot of Colorado listeners imbibing a certain substance and asking many of these similar questions.
Oh no, we won't go there.
Yeah, don't try that. Just try some philosophy, and the results are actually remarkably similar.
Exactly. It's like the meme with it's got the golden retriever staring out at the sunset on the beach, and it says, "When your dog eats your philosophy homework." It's like, he's just like,
I love it, man.
What is eternity? What is being?
It's so good.
What about the universe?
It's so good and it's so true. So
yeah. Well, Kasey, thanks so much. I know we went long on this one again, but it was super worth it. This book is also super worth it. And I should mention that it is our Colson Center Premium for the month of March. So in the next couple of weeks, if you visit colsoncenter.org/March for a gift of any amount, we're going to send you this book. It's really worth it. I've enjoyed it a lot, and I enjoyed my conversation with Oz. And I hope that we get some more books out of him because he is just an inexhaustible source of wisdom. And like I said, that voice of the past, just sort of bringing all those voices to bear, the democracy of the dead. I really appreciate his work, and I appreciate you being here, Kasey. So thank you.
Anytime, Shane. Thanks for having me.